So this is the week where we're going to finish off the midsection while looking at the muscles in that connective area, and also hopefully get to the top of the leg. We did take it very slow last week. It did take some time to set up some of the information. So while I consider that to be incredibly important to make sure that everybody is comfortable with the method that I'm practicing, it does have a tendency to slow us down. So I apologize if it didn't feel like we got to a lot last week, but I really wanted to make sure that we didn't overwhelm with information what should stand out as our plan of attack. So I hope that this week we'll get a little bit more done. I definitely think that it's going to be likely because we're not having to spend a lot of time making sure that this is clear. So without further ado, let's start talking about our muscles. We're going to talk about the trunk and how to design those for the practical purpose of drawing. Again, we'll be using the same type of reference imagery, and we'll start by talking about the abdominal muscles, and specifically the rectus abdominis. So the rectus abdominis, or your abs, abdominal wall, is a very kind of well-known muscle. I guess it also has kind of that hero quality and does get always used and overdeveloped in comics. And this is our basic shape, the connection between the rib cage and pelvis, where the muscle can allow or produce that motion, kind of bringing the two together. And here on the Goldfinger slide, you can see that insertion here really well, and the origin point. So we have that insertion and origin, which is creating the bridge between the two, and we'll come back to that. So here's our rectus abdominis, just to give a kind of lay of the land, stuff that we'll be wanting to discuss. Good way to think about the muscles of the trunk in the front here is that we really do get these different motions. You can think of this star pattern if it helps to make it any easier. The rectus abdominis responsible for that up and down motion. The external oblique responsible for that diagonal motion down, being countered by the internal oblique. Internal oblique being seen here, which is underneath the external oblique, which is something that we'll talk about on the outside. We're not going to be talking too much about the internal muscles, like the transverse abdominis or the internal oblique. Transverse abdominis is the muscle that's going to allow for us to do some of this, side to side. So that's a basic way to kind of conceive simply of a lot of the function of the muscles and what they're doing in the abdomen area. For our purposes, we're going to focus on large surface muscle or surface anatomy. So we'll be talking about the abdominal wall, the external oblique, and then the spinal muscles on the back, and the latissimus to finish off our torso area. So for our muscle shape in the abdomen, we can take a closer look at Goldfinger. Again, here we have the insertion, origin, muscle isolated, context, photographic depiction, and then the side view. Again, this is a small illustration from the Visual Human project, which I've provided just to give you a different view, just a different sense of the context. Let's go ahead and start designing the abdominal wall based off of some of the things that we've discussed here in our Photoshop. So I'm going to come back to the idea of establishing a basic, simple shape built off of stuff that we have discussed as design elements. And we're going to continue with our multicolored figure. So very commonly we'll see the abdominal wall drawn as symmetrical. And this is the basic shape that I'm going to give it. Although, again, we're going to have to make modifications. It's essentially a bullet shape that I'm looking to design that has a point of symmetry. This bullet shape is going to fit in right here. The flat part going right up underneath the pectoralis. That way I can observe that straight line becoming a wrapping line if the figure turns at all. And then I also take the opportunity here to build a rhythm off of the pectoralis, the sides, as they start to pull down. So we're starting with a general conception of the shape, and then we're going to make modifications. The rounded part of the bullet is going to touch and connect here into the bottom of the pelvis, just like we saw in the Goldfinger view. So that's my placement and shape for the abdominal wall. We'll also take a look from the side view, so we'll develop a new little map so that we can get a sense of what this looks like. Now this shape can be changed for female, so to take on kind of a gendered conception. I usually will make it more of a kind of like a vase design, so that we get the idea here for some of that shifting in the rib cage and thinning. So something more like that possibly. In the abs, what we have generally shown, and we did see a little bit in the Goldfinger book, is the idea of a six-pack, which we're not really going to see quite as often. We're more likely to see 4 and then a larger development of abs down below. And so something more like this would probably be a little bit more accurate. As the 6th sit a little bit higher and is more of a genetic irregularity. And so what I will do in this though is try to build it off of the 4. And we're going to have it starting very high or kind of peaked. Let's say that this is the area for the 6th, but we're going to keep that, make it dotted so it's less likely to be seen. And as we start to divide these down, we're going to find that the arrow quality of the divisions gets less as they move down. So while the top is really pointed, as we start to move our way down, this is getting closer to being horizontal towards the area of the belly button. And then building off of my bullet shape, I would make these a little bit longer. So that's the basic breakup for the abs. It's not that you won't see these, it's just that it's rarer. Another thing that would be more realistic as a suggestion for the abdomen is that you don't keep them perfectly symmetrical. So this quality of them being right next to each other isn't really how we'll see the abs. There's going to be much more of a kind of offset quality between them, or an asymmetry. Right? So that's just something to keep in mind, so that when you do make your own drawings, you'll pick up on some of these more specific organic qualities that will make it feel a little bit more real. So that's the type of design that I'm going to be thinking about giving inside the larger general bullet shape, which we'll use always to kind of situate the perspectives. Now the perspective of the muscle of it itself. This muscle I'd like to think about as a type of box. So if I were to kind of turn the bullet, it would be a shallow bullet, but it would still have a perspective, a side, and then a front. So I think that's important for being able to see and understand the planes of the midsection. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if we can situate this on our model, and then we can build one down towards the side, or towards the bottom of our page that will look at the side view. Okay, as far as our organic model, or our view for the figure position, remember I want to think about off of the pectoralis as perhaps a way to build a rhythm, connecting up under. And borrow this wrapping line, and then here's our bullet structure down, and so this side we're having more of a pinch. So in thinking through or kind of anticipating that idea, let's say that maybe we could also think about this shape as being able to pinch, like all other ones, but it's going to be much more manageable, I think, if we view it as a basic shape. So here's a way to think about the pinch even before we're developing perspective. Right? Just throwing a few C curves in there and then making sure that overlap stays nice and consistent. And then we'll lay it in. So having done some of that work off to the side just to plan out what's going on, I'm going to just go ahead and start to integrate in the muscle. Big S curve here for obvious reasons. This is a stretched view. And then this is going to be more pinched. So I could kind of, if it helps, start to suggest that to myself through very subtle kind of overlap idea. And then pulling back and into the pelvis. What we're also going to see in this, and will be, I'll try to be a little bit clearer as far as the planes when seen from the side, is a front and back as far as an asymmetrical division of space based on the compartments. You'll generally find that the first come out, you see this in light, as it's on the ribcage or closer to. The next section receiving halftone as it becomes a plane that starts to pull in, back out again. Here we see this receiving light, and then the last pulls down to the pelvis and receives shadow or halftone. I think that's a great way to start to think about the planar division of this muscle, or what it allows, because I think it's going to be a great benefit to painting or modeling or anything that will describe the light effects. So again, an asymmetry, or a type of coming out, coming back, and this can be a way that you start to kind of work into this muscle that really does, give it perspective. So this is pulling, coming out, and then I'm kind of refining my stretch down here. And then we'll see this is that flatter division closer to the area of the belly button there, and then back. And I think you could see pretty well how that relates to the areas of the tone. And then here, trying to keep some type of side plane. I'm trying to make sure that the viewer will understand this is a volume and not as just a shape. So however you want to execute that, whether it be with wrapping lines, the planes, and or some idea there for a side, any of those would be fine. And now I'm just going to get rid of a little bit of that so we can see the muscle. So that's our abdominal wall. And let's do something from the side view just so that we can have a view of it there. So side view. What we should also do to the side here is going to draw out a twist just to make sure that we try to get a sense, or at least a designed, edited sense for what's going to go on when we see the twisting take place. So here's my simple idea for rib cage and pelvis. There's my clavicle, sternum. And just while we're thinking about it, let's make some type of twist. And hopefully you remember from the landmarks week that when we do have the twist, remember the symmetry line is going to show us more of an S. So now I would have this and this. Sorry, I should have done that first so that you didn't have to spend time where you should be getting information just watching. Okay, so let's go back and grab our color here, our color for the abdominal wall, and just take a look at how some of that can be understood from the side. So from our side view here, try to think of the abdominal wall as just following the planes. And so it's kind of coming off of the rib cage here first. We talked about that kind of stair-step pattern. And then it's going to pull back in. And then we saw around the area of the belly button how it received light again. So we're getting that accordion effect, which was not unlike or all that different from the spine in the way it's moving, or the profile, or any number of other elements that we've already talked about. So there would be our rectus abdominis from the side, just so you get a sense, and probably bring it down a little bit. And then we're also going to see that in a twisted view, bending or twisting. So again, if it's easier to come back and think of it, like a box, that bullet shape, I'm all about that. I'm making this a simpler process and a faster process. So on this, what we're going to do is, or what we can do, is just think about the S design, right, for the bullet. And I try to keep very simple rules for twists so they don't give the viewer too much information, which is going to be confusing to them. So it's based on triangles, and which a lot of stuff is, I guess. But here, where I have the facing side of the abdominal wall here, I give the plane, which you can see kind of starts to look like a triangle as it's going back. And then here I have to show the opposite. Here's another triangle. That's just the reverse. And now I have the abdominal wall facing this way, and then that way. So if we're going to deal with the abdominals, or the abdominal wall, I'll be thinking here, that same approach. And to make this exaggerated for a volume, here's a side plane, as would be here. And then everyone knows I'm all about color. Coated muscles. So here's our abdominal wall. And in quick review, this line is now on top. This has become a volume that exists on top. And even though it encourages the read of volume, it's indistinct, or it has its own kind of autonomy for perspective. And then here is our other side, and this is going to tie down in a consistent line with the pelvis. Okay, and that's it. That's our abdominal wall. Obviously not going to see it from the back, so we don't need to do any work there. Front, I guess we could always color it in real quickly so that we could see what we put together. So, built from the basic general shape into something that's kind of more perspective and form-based. So those are our abdomen muscles. Let's move on now to the external oblique, and we'll talk about that as we kind of move back here to the side and give a basic design overview first. So we'll do that now. The external oblique that we're going to be looking at is a muscle that in a way sits above the rectus abdominis. If we come back to this early slide that we took a look at already, the externus oblique here, or external oblique, is attaching to this large tendinous sheet, and we could see that this is going to be something that covers over the abdomen. Right? So here we have this side with the secondary, or the muscles underneath that sheet, which should include the internal oblique, rectus abdominis. So the external oblique is going to be attaching to that on the sides, and then you can also see fusing into the individual ribs, where we're going to meet up with another muscle that we're or have already studied. So here is our origin, where we see the external oblique hitting into the lower ribs, 5th and down, 5 to 10 here, and we also have the insertion, this large kind of tendinous band. So what we're going to take for our design is this quality more, where we have this area of primary digitation. And what I want to look for that, or to add in, is how it's meeting with the serratus. And so we have when we talked about this last week, the hand that's coming around from the back and grabbing onto the front of the rib cage. I like to create a series of overlaps here. So these T overlaps that show this interdigitation. So we see these fitting together. And again, 3. I'm looking to get 3 at the most to show that primary quality or area of digitation. And then from this, I'm going to start to just kind of make and edit down a straight line. I'm going to keep the digitation stronger towards the top of my design as kind of being more angular or angled. And then towards the bottom, I'm going to design in more of a teardrop shape. And this is from the side. So that's how I'm going to break up this shape into those 2 distinct areas. So from the front, you could see how that would be similar, but it would just be varied in the sense that we're changing our perspective relationship to it. And so it's going to be thinner in design. And you want to keep it as simple as possible so that you can incorporate it into the drawing. You can always go more detailed as long as it's included there. That's the most important thing to start out with. Also, remember to look for your landmarks here. So we have the anterior superior crest of the iliac spine, where we're going to see that muscle kind of fold or crest onto, as well as the pelvis here. And so you can see how it's seated on top of that landmark that we've looked at. It's also moving to the back. So you see the progression of the muscle here. That's something I'm going to keep in mind when I start to draw the back or front view, as I'm going to suggest that with overlaps, right, just so we get a little bit of a spatial consideration for the muscle. Okay, so these are the other muscles that we'll be seeing under the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis. So I just included these 2 views so that you get a sense of what it is that would also be working as part of that star principle that we covered earlier. And now let's build it on top of this side view that we have, and then we can take a look at putting it back on top of our larger model. So let's first deal here with shapes and our maps. So again, from the side view, if I'm thinking about kind of a line of descent down from the abdomen all the way from the front to the back, this could also be a wrapping line if we're thinking in terms of it as a perspective. This is where I'm going to think about including those areas of primary digitation. So let's keep it to 3, and let's also come in here and build in a straight line. So this is how I'm going to think about the shape. Straighter in through here. This is part of that teardrop shape towards the bottom, which I'm going to probably consider here the part that would be attaching to the back. And then everything here at the top is going to be more boxed or serrated. So let's just do our 3. And then that would be where we could start to look for the serratus shape. So that's our shape from the side. From the front, you can try to use this shape, or you can try using something different. Many times I'll use kind of like a column shape. So let's jump up to our shape here. I think it's pretty easy from the front if you want to just think through more of a column-like shape to the top, or you want to use architectural metaphor like we've spoken of. You can think in terms of like a pillar. something like this. I think that's an accurate way of conceiving simply of this muscle, and that would go right in here, or you could try changing the end to be a little bit more teardrop-like. We already kind of have discussed this as far as its pinch and stretch, as it's one of the connection areas that we've looked at earlier. It's the connection between ribcage and pelvis that we've used squash and stretch to identify. So in many ways we have already done the job of looking at the gesture of this muscle. So we have it on one side there, and then we'll put it on here. Here we can think about it kind of swinging down, as we want to keep this as a volume, and then it would be visible here. Egg shape or teardrop. So there's my maps. Let's try it now on our more developed perspective model, where the goal is just going to be to make sure that I use the muscle form or volume to still say gesture, but also to now have a perspective. So it's going to be swinging down, and what I'll like to do is kind of set up a wrapping line, or it could be something that wraps both sides. And we talked to, or have talked about, the benefits of relating gesturally symmetrical muscles. Here we can start to now think about kind of the teardrop portion, and this side definitely going to be pinched, because we have the weight-bearing leg on the side that we're currently drawing. And then I'm going to just wrap that teardrop to the front, show an overlap, side, and then back up. So now this shape is being forced up into that pinch. And then here we would have the front kind of coming down. So this would be our pinch side, and as such, let's give a better idea for the overlaps. So I want to get a T overlap. I've kind of moved the arm just out to the side so we could take a look at this, which is maybe why we don't see it quite as well in the model, or it is why we don't see it quite as well. And this is wrapping, and then I like to do everything I can to give a little bit of a corner, just so we can make sure that the muscle becomes something with volume. Okay, the other side, let's take a look at as a stretched version of that muscle. Here, down, now the muscle kind of coming in, so that one's getting forced out, and then we're not seeing a whole lot, so my teardrop or egg shape has really gotten stretched out there. Going with that direction on the rib cage, and that's our shape. So now we have our pinched and our stretched version for that muscle, and then just to be consistent, we'll give overlap. And I probably could bring up this arm just a tad as well. So there's our back view, side view, and then not to be forgotten, let's talk about how we can design these so that they show a twist. So like I showed the competing triangles on that side, I think it's going to be here very similar. Just based again off having found the landmarks and seeing the planes. So if you want to kind of create this wrapping line to generalize the positioning, and then what we'll do from there is start the muscle on top broader, and then here it's going to get brought to a point. Here, muscle comes from behind, bottom portion of the rib cage, and then I'm losing there, the section. This would be a front plane, this would be obviously an overlap. So there's our triangle. That's our competing triangle that will work in opposition to this. Thin triangle at the top, going behind, broader triangle at the bottom. Now that is the bottom of the teardrop shape, starting to rest on top of the crest of the pelvis. And let's just be a little bit clear about the overlaps. So here we go. One thing in front of the other. Doesn't do to not have a volume, so we'll just give this teardrop a little bit rounder of an appearance. It is being pinched after all. And here, our stretch. And so here we get most of our form to the muscle, and then on this side we're seeing it kind of go away. S for the design. Anterior, superior, and then now we have a twist. Side, front, side, front, side, or front, side. So I think that's a helpful exercise, is to kind of come through here and start to really provide a linear mapping, again, like we've talked about, of how you see all this stuff kind of coming together in terms of its form. Okay, so we have a couple more to do, and I think we'll be able to get a little bit done for the leg. Let's take a look now at the muscle on the back, and that will complete our kind of investigation of some of these torso muscles. We'll look now at the erector spinae. Okay, so let's just go ahead and add the external oblique, which we talked about here from the side and the back, onto our front, so that we get the presentation of the front 3/4. As you can see here, it's kind of mostly done for us in the sense that we address this area as a transition section very early on. So we have had quite a bit of the pinch and stretch already worked out for us in a sense. So same thing though, I'm going to be thinking about the insertion points. Let's see, we should get a little bit darker so we can see it. And here, so these are my areas of interdigitation or overlap, and I'm going to try to bring this all the way around. I want to see this going to the back, if for no other reason, so I think about creating that overlap there. So then we'll bring down the shape. Here it's going to be that area of, remember that pillar or teardrop. And I'm also going to reference with just a subtle line the equality for a corner here. So it shows the front, and then I'm going to show it a side. Any way we could think, or you could think about to remember the design is fine. Remember we had the more box-like or serrated quality above, and then you could make this more of the teardrop as it's starting to overlap. Might be a good opportunity there to show the pinch all the way around the top of the pelvis here, and then I'm going to bring it up and then overlap. So again, same process, finding my insertions, making sure they relate to perspective. If you've done a great job with the landmarks, there's no reason that they should. Addressing the muscle here with a pinch to make sure that the gesture feels consistent. And now we have an additive element. It's that sculptural process. Here, same thing. T overlap behind. This is getting very stretched. So instead of creating a surface form, I'm going to be maybe based on what we had prior, subtracting, so that it becomes a little bit subtractive in a sense. And then I'm going to have that pull down, get a little bit more form at the bottom where it's kind of pushing into our area of connection. And that's it. This side doesn't get a whole lot of form. We're mostly seeing this as a front and profile. Now just a couple of lines to make sure that we understand the surface forms that we're setting up here. Kind of how we already have the abdomen developed. We have a side and a front. I don't want to think that all the way around. As far as the oblique, or what I see of it here, that would be a front. It's the front of the muscle before it takes and then moves around to the side. And here, just using these darker lines to kind of give a better sense of the overlaps. Bring in my landmark a little bit. This is now a front, kind of like we showed here, and then a side. So this being a kind of pretty complex area as far as the forms go, I think it's worth the time to come in and kind of try to explain what it is you build on. And our serratus would be coming down further. I've just kind of worked here more so with the shape for the sake of simplicity. Remember, these connect all the way down to the 9th rib. maybe even think about here developing an interior corner for the muscle. Just taking the idea of the pinch and then assigning it to the muscle inside, so that you get the sense that it's kind of become more of a sphere or cylinder in its compression away through that pinch of the rib cage against the pelvis. Okay, so that's our external oblique, which leaves us with a couple muscles to do, and then I had mentioned that we could begin looking at the leg. We can certainly do that, and I think that we'll just lay in a few shapes to introduce the leg, and then what we'll do after that is spend a little bit of time, or save ourselves a little bit of time next week when we start the leg. So we're coming down to the end. Next week is the leg, and then the week after is going to be the arm, and then that will be kind of the conclusion for the course. So last muscle we'll take a look at is the externus oblique. I'm sorry, not the externus oblique as we just did it, the rector spinae, or your spinal muscles. In other words, spinal erectors. These are muscles that will work in the upper back and start bundled and progressively deplete as they move from the sacrum all the way up to the base of the cranial mass. They're going to be grabbing onto the spinuous process of the spine. So this is something that we're going to have to, in a sense here, take away the trapezius to add on. So let's find whatever layer that was. That's probably good enough, so we can get a nice view underneath. So the spinal erectors, first let's start with our map. So here we have our back view, and let's make these their own color for the back. We'll make it orange. Spinal erectors, two different types of volumes. They're going to be going under the tail of the trapezius. There's essentially a column, and this is what we're going to see as the muscle is kind of bundled, or leaving the sacrum here at the bottom. As the muscle starts to move up from that central column, we'll have more of a lateral column, and that's going to be the muscle moving up into the ribs and attaching to the spinuous process, again depleting the more it goes up. So remember this as a corn dog shape, whatever it is that has kind of significance iconically for you. So here is going to be where it begins. This is where I'm thinking of the spinal erector starting. This is one side, of course, of which there will be two, and then that larger, broader shape is going to be in here, at least where I'm thinking of its placement. So that would be just one. If it's easy or more simple in the process of drawing this to think about this collectively, to think about a larger shape rhythmically that can exist between these two scapula, and then you're building from just a unified mass here from the bottom. I think that as far as the drawing process goes, that would be okay. It's just that here, you wouldn't want to convince yourself through practice that would be the actual case. Right? At some point you would want to start to think about how these are distinct and different from each other from side to side. And this is helping with kind of maintaining an upright posture and a lot of the movements back, pulling the rib cage backwards against the pelvis in the most simple of terms. So there is our spinal erector. Let's take another look at it here on the side, our side view. I'm not going to see it from the front. We took our side views away, so let's look at it in the back view. Back view, or let's go ahead and add back the side view for now. There's going to be a volume or a mass in here, and its main form or perspective is going to be that it's following the spine. So that's something that I did want to point out here from the side before we looked at it from the 3/4 back, just because it's going to be these perspectives that I'm looking to set up or articulate. So spinal erector all the way up, and then we have the small attachment here, and now from the back. So for the back view, where is it? There it is. What I want to make sure that I allow this volume to show is the different perspectives from the rib cage into the pelvis. So here is our basic models for form and space that we've set up earlier. The muscle, as it leaves the pelvis, is going to follow this perspective, right? It has to. It's communicating the idea that this continuation or continued perspective of the pelvis leads into the rib cage. Then when the muscle hits the rib cage, it'll change, because now it's starting to move back. And roughly at about halfway, we're going to see the muscle starting to go this way as the rib cage changes in the thoracic portion into the neck. So that's the only kind of difficult part about thinking through the addition of this muscle. And again, this is really about trying to see form and space in the construction or invention of the figure. So it's really putting the anatomy to use in showing that goal, more than to make kind of a very clinical, medical-like illustration. For a little bit of identification purposes, I think we can see some of the muscle volume in here. It's being affected by the scapula on this side. And you can see this long kind of central column. So kind of working in through here and then ending. So this is about as far as I generally take it for the purposes of making the drawing or showing the figure. I think it's also very beneficial to think through the placement of the muscle, especially in the middle of the back, as we do find quite a bit of squash and stretch, depending on how the scapula is moving against this. As the trapezius does sit on top of this, we're going to see it covered, but you could think of it as still being responsible for the presentation of form underneath. Okay, and now we could give it a shot here. Again, I've exaggerated for a little bit of complication, just so we could show some differences in the muscles based on how we've been discussing them. So let's take the idea that we're going to start as general as possible. We have the shape that we discussed as corn dog, and I'm going to start to put it in. I'm going to just be connecting the points. So first, shape based on landmark, and what I already know or notice here is that I'm going to have a asymmetry in the muscle. This side is stretched. I can tell just by the placement of the landmarks. This side will be much less so, if not pinched. Then I can still come up and try to kind of work the muscle shape around. It's always easier to establish these things more rhythmically first, that are also a little bit more generalized and larger. So again, there's my big, giant corn dog shape. And then I'm going to come inside after clearly showing the muscle, and we'll discuss some issues about the perspective or the form building opportunity that this muscle has given us. So on this side, let's now take and split it up. Here would be the spine in the middle. And remember, as the muscle is going up, it's progressively attaching to the ribs and getting depleted. And so as we kind of move up from this one, or from the central column, you'll see the muscle attaching to the ribs. And then as it's going up, higher and higher and higher, it's going to get thinner, 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 all the way up. So that's how I'm abstracting or generalizing this shape. It's always just I'm trying to simplify what I know the anatomy to be doing. But let's talk more so here about the perspective. We can understand the depletion quality of the muscle as making the volume less as it gets towards the top. So here let's make it much more cylindrical, and I'm just going to copy these perspective ideas. Forward, back, and then forward again. And so it has to follow the spine. So this is a cylinder, column. As soon as it hits the rib cage, it's going to start to push with it. And remember, we have the determining influence is the thoracic portion of the spine. And then forward at the top. So you can see I'm doing all but including a straight line here, because I think that's going to be something that will flatten the quality of muscle. And so you just want to get it to kind of flow upwards with that perspective. This side more pinched. See a little bit more of it because of the perspective, the angle. And we also see that because the arm is pushed back, we see a little bit of a pinch in here. So that's something I might want to think about while I'm designing. And that's it. That would be our erector spinae. So let's put the trapezius back on top. And there we go. I think that would be the muscle well underneath. Take one more look. Important here to understand that the tail layer. Again, I'm going to make sure that I do my best to get these on the blog, the analytical figure drawing blog, which I hope all of you have been finding useful and have used as a resource. Again, I know that a lot of the drawings that we do here are kind of studies of poses that are used over again for the kind of analytical procedures, but doing the homework, try to find variation. You know, I'm trying to kind of work here from a norm or what would be an average in a sense. So see if you can find different poses and different people, more females. Right? We use a lot of males in the kind of setup of our examples, and then try to find harder positions and present them as homework. Right? I'm happy to help you in the homework to explore more of the variation from the average that I've presented here. So that's our front and back. I think we could take a quick break and look at the anatomical qualities here in this muscle, or the plate, I should say. So this is again from Goldfinger, one of our go-to books for this course. And I want to just make sure that I give you a better illustration of what the muscle is doing and how I'm arriving at my abstraction or my shape abstraction. So here's the origin point where we saw that central column or cylindrical column building from, all of this area, and then how we talked about its progressive depletion as it's moving up and in through the ribs and attaching all the way at the base of the cranial mass on the side, or that corner point. Here's the volume, so the cylindrical volume becoming much less and elliptical at the top, also in between the scapula point. The visibility of the muscle, we're seeing, I think, quite a bit here. So you could still find this muscle to be influential on the surface, much like how we saw in the Proudhon drawing, evidence of this pushing through, creating halftone or subtle value shifts to allow you to recognize its placement and position. And then from the back, so I just kind of made a simple color gesture as to where the muscle is placed, but again, here's a really nice illustration of exactly where you'd be seeing it. And then from Goldfinger, one final illustration to show you all the different muscles that we've kind of been through on our progressive study of the midsection and how they're working. So the twist, the stretch backwards, the thinking position, or that active state for the abdomen, pulling the figure down, stretching the erector spinae, the pinch of the spinal erector, so leaning one side while the other side is stretching. So it really does take into account all of our activities here. So always go in to your poses trying to be as brief or as controlled as possible in what the description is, so as not to get overcomplicated in the muscle. This is the rhomboid muscle. It's not one that we're going to be talking so much about, but we did talk about it as antithesis or the counter muscle for the serratus, so that we have this inward motion that's pulling then against what the serratus is doing for the scapula, which is to pull it forward and onto the side of the rib cage. Trapezius we've covered. last week and this week, I wanted to make sure I just did include these so that you had them again. The visual human project, the texture or some of the volume qualities to the trapezius, and then some of the gesture qualities in Gottfried Bommes. And I'm going to do my best also to put these PowerPoint presentations on the blog, as well as a book list, bibliography, so that you know exactly where I'm getting the imagery. And I encourage all of you to get the books to make sure that you have access to the original work, so to speak. And the last muscle for the torso that we're going to be talking about is the latissimus. The latissimus muscle is going to be one of those larger, or one of the largest climbing muscles that we have to the back. And it's going to be attaching to our arm. It's going to be attaching, as you can see, in the front of the arm. Here's our insertion point. And this is that giant muscle that bodybuilders always overdevelop. So we see the muscle changing here, and so they're not ever able to put down their arms. They just kind of walk around with their arms projected out to the sides. That's this muscle. So we use it to pull down the arm in climbing or swimming or activities like that. So here's the origin, all along the top of the iliac, up the spine, so you can see it, lumbar, thoracic, 3 ribs, and then to the front. So here's our shape. It has a quality very common to what we looked at on the pectoralis. So you could see the tail here, or this triangular quality, where the muscle is overlapping or kind of flipped over onto itself. That is something that really important to think about for function. So just like the pectoralis can unravel or flip over to allow for extended stretch in the movement of the humerus, so this muscle can do the same, and really does need to be able to do so for the purposes of allowing the arm to move and give the freedom of movement. It's important here that we don't confuse this muscle, latissimus, with teres major, which is here. And so they get confused quite a bit. Latissimus is going to be going under and more so to the front, higher. And we'll talk about that on the arm week. But for the purposes of doing homework this week, do try to make a concerted effort to separate those out. And you want to make sure that you're not confusing them. I think that that will happen quite easily and quite often, is the confusion of the teres major and the latissimus, or the grouping of them. Here's from the side view, so we can see the importance and size of the muscle, and also how it's attaching here. One of the reasons that we're not showing more of our serratus is partially because of latissimus and how much here it covers. You can also see how some of our oblique is being covered by this muscle as well, how these overlaps are starting to show the muscle not quite as well. So we're not seeing some of those attachment points that we talked about on the back. So my inclination to provide an overlap there is more than suitable, right? As it just kind of suggests the perspective position while we anticipate building the latissimus on top. Okay, so let's add this on, and then we could see where we stand. This will be something that we'll return to and talk about in a second. So let's start on the back. So we want to make sure that we start with our dictionary of shape, which you can see we've kind of built to be pretty extensive now. The latissimus muscle, let's do a darker color to sit on some muscles beneath, is here with 2 triangles, a big bowl, and again I'm thinking all these as flattened pieces of fabric that are just going to be laid out, and then it could have 1 or 2 legs. It can have 1 giant leg. I think it a common kind of rhythmic relationship from side to side, or you could break it up more so into the top of the iliac crest there. So think of it like a bowl with hands and legs, or whatever else you can think of that would help. And now what I'd want to think about is, after its shape, how it's going to change with gesture. And we have a very simple or simplified idea for the gesture here. So let's go in and do that. That's maybe too much. So here it's going to be attaching into the front. So most importantly is that I'm going to want to show that with an overlap. It's going to come over the serratus, and it's also going to come over the scapula. So it's going to be in here. It's not going to go over the trapezius. So there it does have to go under. Here's where it's swinging down. So it's going to cover over the serratus, pull down, and then fit on the top of the pelvis in the back. And I'm going to leave it here as a shape, find a rhythm across or a curve, and then put the other leg on this side. Here is the stretch. So for this view, we have on the right side here static position or just kind of normal, no exertion. This side will be stretched. So we have the tail unfold. This is going to start to become more of an S in design. It's also going to thin, which means that we're more likely to see a lot of the musculature underneath or ribs. And then let's fill it in so that we get an idea of primary and secondary surface form. So hopefully this study through anatomy has been helpful in the sense that it's worked from the inside and then built or stacked as we've moved further and further out, working from something of a secondary to more superficial, even though these are all superficial. And that's our latissimus. So we have that in our shape design. Here we would see it front, stretching, and then maybe here we'd see just a little bit of a profile shape or design. So it's going to help kind of build some of our profile mass. And now let's go take a look at more of our perspective-driven design. Perhaps we see it right here on our Punhan drawing. Maybe this is our stretch shape, and then here it's going to be most of this shape. So I've again moved the arm back, so let's include it here. Attachment behind, and let's make this a little bit of an S. So there's our shape. And then we have one of the final puzzle pieces for today. On this side, and then behind. So let's be a little bit darker here and include our overlaps, so there's no confusion as to how the shapes work. Okay, last part here being the back. Let's find it in perspective a little bit better. Sorry, let's just grab the color so that we could be consistent. And I'm going to do the same thing. It's just here I'm going to get a better opportunity to show some of the planes. So I know it's going to the front, so I'm going to show that as an overlap. It's going to the front, and maybe if you're kind of just getting the hang of attaching these to the perspective, you want to start going around and just putting some landmark points in. Here's the flow of the muscle and its connection or relationship. Over, so I want to tuck the scapula under, and then I'm going to end the latissimus there. Here it's going to follow with my form. I'm going to show a little window. And then this is pulling up. And under. What you can do is just kind of make a relationship line here. if it's helpful to make a wrapping line that's kind of showing this quality, right, the roundness to the rib cage, has that elliptical design. That's what we're really trying to get at. You know, the muscle is meant for us to show form. Still believable activities or consequences of the muscle and its design, but we don't want it to flatten what we've done prior, first and foremost. So that's what I try to give, even if this is an implied line, right, a line that's really dark here and then dark here, gives an implied motion between the points so that the viewer still fills it in. And some composition books call that implied or psychic lines. Implied is probably better. And then fill it in. So here's our shape. And then with all the other muscles, we'll probably just give it a perspective so that we can understand it as a volume on its own. And the volume is absolutely going to change depending on the activity. So whereas here we have this stretch, it's going to be thinned out, which means that the surface volume is going to be kind of redistributed. Here, relatively thin. Most of the volume in this muscle is again going to be in this area, that bodybuilder area. And just being a little bit clearer to build some volume here with the overlap. Right, so you get a front, back. And then this one we did leave out our deltoid, so we can put it on this side to give you a sense of the relationship. And so now we've done quite a bit for the muscles of the torso. Maybe excessive to talk about the leg today, but we could also, and what I think I'll do is just give a brief introduction so that next week it's not going to be overwhelming and we'll be able to kind of move through the entire leg as a subject. For the torso, I always do like to break it into 2 weeks in any classroom situation, just so every student has an opportunity to really come to terms with process, because that may be kind of different or unorthodox in the presentation of anatomy as building form and shape and pattern, and not kind of a more clinical look. So thank you for your patience in kind of allowing me to talk about this and kind of focus on those forms. Thank you for your patience in kind of allowing me to talk about this and kind of focus on those forms or issues. Hopefully that they kind of were helpful. For the leg, what we're going to talk about next week, more in depth, is how we get from here to here. And so just as a quick review, a lot of the landmarks for this iliac crest is something that we're going to leave exposed. And so this is, in a sense, a continental divide. For your homework, one thing that you can start to do, as some of the muscles you've already done for part of the 4th week, is you can start to look just a little bit more closely at an area here. Finding the landmarks right after you've worked through the torso, anterior superior, anterior inferior crest of the iliac, and that's something that we're going to talk about next week. Pubic symphysis, coming in and finding the landmarks in the legs, the head of the great trochanter of the femur, great trochanter, knee, patella, tibia, fibula, and being a little bit more clear with these landmarks for your homework, just so when we start next week you'll be kind of refreshed and remembering all the different things that we talked about. Another thing I'd like you to think about for homework, and this is probably as far as the review will go for the leg today, is to think about the pinch and stretch possible here at the hip. So we've talked about a lot of larger areas of transition, connection, neck, rib cage, but we haven't talked so much about smaller areas. And those smaller areas are the shoulder, but we have covered them kind of anatomically, and now into the hip. And so do think about this week. If there's a lot of weight, or if this is bearing the weight, we're going to have more of a C curve, and perhaps if the leg is stretched back, you'll be able to provide a design that is more of a S curve, even if it's just subtle and nominal. Again, for that, bring these lines around and start to think about wrapping, and then overlaps as you think about kind of where the muscle would, at this point you're assuming where the muscle would go. But I think that would be a great exercise just to get you warmed up for what I'd like to get done next week. So we're building a little bit more speed each time. Next week we're really going to move through the entirety of the leg, of course looking at large general surface and anatomical masses. Same thing would apply here for this back view. So here we have C curve. Think about a kind of a wrapping line quality. And then perhaps here this would be more of an S. Here's my great trochanter, femur, and then we're out of room. So next week again, review of the landmarks and anatomical masses of the legs. But in the meantime, I look forward to seeing some of your homework from this week, which will be a kind of continuation of the anatomy of the upper torso. Okay, thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next week.